Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 10th Annual Paul Buteux Memorial Lecture, co-hosted by the Center for Defense and Security Studies and part of the J.W. Defoe Political Studies Students Conference here at the University of Manitoba. I'd like to acknowledge that we were on original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. My name is Ashley Holden, and I am joined tonight by my colleague Jay Dion. We are both Masters of Arts candidates in the Department of Political Studies, as well as co-organizers of the J.W. Defoe PSSC. Tonight would not be possible without the generous contributions from CIC Winnipeg, the U of M's Visiting Lecturer Program, the Arts Endowment, the Government of Canada Mines Program, and the J.W. Defoe Foundation, and many departments at the University of Manitoba, including Institute for Humanities, the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies, Political Studies, History, and the Duff Roblin Professor. A sincere thank you as well to Amy Backhouse from the Daily Bread Cafe, Chris and David helping with AV here tonight, and Amber Osterman from Communications.
Dr. Paul Buteux was an integral part of the University of Manitoba's community for over 45 years. As a professor of international relations, he was the leading Canadian scholar on nuclear weapons, nuclear deterrence, and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Dr. Buteux was committed to academic excellence, education, and public debate on defense and security issues. He established the Center for Defense and Security Studies in 1992 and served as its first director, preceding Dr. James Fergusson and Dr. Andrea Charron. Throughout his efforts and initiative, the Center established the University of Manitoba as a leading voice on international, strategic, and Canadian defense issues. Dr. Buteux was a favorite among students because he was an outstanding teacher and mentor. Thanks to his commitment, many of his students have gone on to successful careers in academia, the private sector, and government. Additionally, Dr. Buteux created the annual Political Studies Students Conference, the longest-standing student conference of its kind in Canada, this year celebrating its 39th year. His purpose was to provide valuable experience to students in organizing an international conference and exposing them to the leading national and international scholars and policymakers. Dr. Buteux's commitment to bring together students, academics, the media, and practitioners to discuss new research continues with this year's memorial lecture. I will first welcome Eleni Iskierski to the podium to introduce Dr. Greg Smith.
Thank you, Jay and Ashley, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Paul Buteux Memorial Lecture. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Greg Smith, who is Vice Provost of Academic Planning and Programs and a professor with the Department of History at the University of Manitoba. With a distinguished career in academia and a commitment to advancing educational initiatives, Dr. Smith has been a driving force behind academic planning and program development within our faculty and throughout the university. It is our privilege to have Dr. Smith here to introduce our distinguished guest lecturer for this evening's event. Please join me in extending a very warm welcome to Dr. Greg Smith.
Thank you, Lenny, and congratulations to Jay Dion on being awarded with the Paul Buteux Fellowship. Tansy, good evening, everyone. I'm here on behalf of President Venerosh to welcome you. And so on behalf of the University of Manitoba, it's my pleasure to welcome our distinguished guests and tonight's keynote speaker, Robert Baines. I'm going to be brief as I'm eager to hear Mr. Baines' lecture tonight. But I want to begin by thanking our donors who support these important lectures, supporting us in hearing new and big ideas. Dr. Buteux's late wife, Iona Starr, alongside many faculty members, helped to endow tonight's lecture series, and we're grateful for that support for events like this this evening. Professor Buteux, as you heard, was a beloved member of our faculty who led the discourse on matters of great concern to NATO, the topic that we will hear more about this evening. Mr. Robert Baines' lecture comes at a globally difficult time and at a time with much instability and conflict in the world. And here in 2024, nearly 75 years of age, NATO is finding even more countries joining or seeking to join its ranks, notably Finland and Sweden. So what is NATO's role in such a world? What is Canada's role in NATO? It is indeed an honor to have Mr. Baines here tonight to provide us with his ideas and answers to these pressing and timely questions. Mr. Baines began his academic career in history and philosophy, and then his path took quite a turn when he joined the Canadian Armed Forces Reserve. That move led to an internship at the Atlantic Council of Canada, the NATO Association's previous name, which was, I guess, a formative experience for him. And I would just say that this is exactly why U of M is putting so much energy into expanding and enhancing our own experiential learning programs, because look what can happen. This is a great outcome. Mr. Baines brings a humanist perspective to his work, one informed by his knowledge of history, his reading of Greek philosophers, and, as I understand it, his appreciation of Star Trek TNG's enlightened leadership of Jean-Luc Picard, captain of the Enterprise. Today, he brings these views to his role as president and CEO of the NATO Association of Canada, where he informs Canadians about the importance of NATO, often using hockey as an analogy. Mr. Baines has an exceptional mind, and it's a real treat to introduce him to you this evening. So, keeping with the hockey theme, please join me now in welcoming tonight's première étoile, the first star, Mr. Robert Baines, to deliver this year's Paul Buteux Memorial Lecture.
Well, I don't think I've ever been introduced quite like that. Thank you so much, and what a pleasure it is to be here this evening on such a warm evening in Winnipeg, something I've never experienced at this time of the year. But it's an absolute pleasure to speak to you today, especially at the Paul Buteux Memorial Lecture. As one of Canada's leading scholars on nuclear deterrence, NATO itself, it's an honor to give a lecture in his name. I would also like to recognize Andrea Charron. Thank you so much for inviting me, and to all the other academics and experts in the room. I hope I will do you justice in getting people warmed up for the various lectures that'll be tomorrow. But my job today is to just talk a little bit about NATO itself and its value to Canada as it approaches 75 years. 75 years of peace and security is something that is not common in the world. It's something that we have to carry in our minds constantly. It's very difficult to remember that again and again, but it is something that we need to bear in mind. My background has been history, and even the remote past, ancient history. And very rarely in human history have we had this much peace, prosperity, and security, and something that cannot be held lightly. And I'm always concerned and do my utmost, and I think everybody in this room must do the same, to make sure Canadians appreciate the value of what we have. I run something, as you heard, called the NATO Association of Canada, dedicated to informing Canadians about the value of security and the importance of NATO. Most Canadians don't have to worry about security. That's great, that's wonderful, but it's also challenging to the maintenance of that security. We currently encounter in headlines day after day about the headwind that our Canadian Armed Forces are facing, and not only our own, but those around the world. We've got many shortages, both of personnel and equipment, ammunition, many different issues that seem to just pass us by day, dripping like Chinese water torture onto the whole large apparatus of not only Canada's military, but a lot of NATO's as well. It's something that we can't ignore, and it's something that takes the effort of many shoulders. And it's not just the world leaders, the ministers, but also those in this room. Citizens must understand the necessity for holding upon many shoulders the burden that NATO and the rest of the rules-based international order requires. It's not that people don't necessarily appreciate security alone. It's that they think it's natural. That is something slightly different. A lot of Canadians, I think that it wafts out of the Canadian shield, but that is not the case. It has been worked on for decades in many different meetings through fighting in the Second World War, and indeed the First World War as well. So it's just so key that our Canadian compatriots understand that. It's taken decades of hard work to develop and maintain, and our support for global security is inextricable from the kind of world we want and the safety of our own country. That's why when the NATO Association continues to work day after day, we want to help establish the value and importance of NATO to Canada, and I hope you'll all join me in that today, especially in the 75th year of the alliance. For many Canadians under the age of 40, NATO kind of broke onto the scene with the invasion, Putin's terrible invasion of Ukraine in 2022. That might seem strange for a lot of those who are older older than 40, but that is largely the case. And the thing is that when NATO broke on the scene for a lot of people, it came kind of fully formed, very complex, amorphous, with many different organs and bodies and committees that are extremely confusing to those who don't understand its core value. So I hope I can explicate a little bit of that today. The NATO of today is remarkable in its breadth. The Vilnius summit of last summer dealt with a laundry list of so-called 360-degree concerns vying for NATO's attentions. If you read it, it really is remarkable. And it's the kind of thing you'd expect from a serious organization trying to protect almost 1 billion citizens. Given the right circumstances, the preponderance of future events to outstrip our imaginations require this kind of planning. Because each one of these problems individually, or a number combined, could easily end up bringing our next great challenge. But most of these concerns, be they Russia, China, nuclear proliferation, energy security, cyber, space, disinformation, resilience of infrastructure and supply chains, AI, innovation and procurement, climate change, they are all mostly to do with what NATO is protecting us from. That's not exactly what I'm going to concentrate on today because there's going to be a lot more discussion about that tomorrow. What I want to talk about is what NATO is protecting, us. What is NATO in its essence? Because it's more than that. It's more than just outward looking. It's inward facing as well. It's centered around what we're protecting, our peace, our societies, our cultural flourishing. That is what NATO is truly about, and about the relationships. I wish you could see them. It's so challenging to explain how important NATO's connections are. NATO meets on almost a daily basis in a kind of parliament, and that means our diplomats are constantly exchanging words, they're meeting each other's spouses, they're getting to know each other on a personal basis. And that is one of the greatest strengths of NATO, which allows the treaty to be flexible and to meet new, challenging circumstances. And NATO, at the end of it, is about relationships and the idea that we'll stand up for one another. It took a lot of work to get us there. NATO and the rules-based international order that we find today were created as an attempt to learn from the overwhelming suffering, death, and destruction of 2 world wars, with perhaps 100 million dead altogether. After the First World War, sincere efforts, I'm sure you all know, were taken to ensure that the globe would not enter into total war again. Alas, those steps were mainly based on hopes and the thought that countries would do the right thing now that everybody understood the industrial nature of modern warfare. Not only the governors, but the citizens of those countries, of all countries in the world, had seen such death during the First World War. It seemed inconceivable. The war to end all wars. It seemed it could be the only way to move forward. However, in the early 1930s, the First Conference on Disarmament and many other initiatives fought to bring countries to that sensible conclusion, that fewer weapons would make for a more peaceful world, and that military action should be outlawed, The citizens of our countries were very much saying that we would not die for our countries in the same useless way that it seemed had occurred during the First World War. These resolutions, however, had no real institutional structure behind them, no force behind them. Instead, what happened was a series of different bilateral treaties between countries saying that they would come to one another's aid, specifically in Europe. So after these resolutions and no institutional structure behind them, it essentially divided attention from underlying global relationships, and these resolutions reportedly made a tremendous impression on Adolf Hitler. Most people will know something, of course, about the expansion of Nazism and Nazi Germany. They spoke words to calm the international community, to rationalize their actions in individual conflicts, and use division and isolation to defeat many adversaries, one by one by one. And the world basically kept its eyes closed for a lot of that. And this spelled disaster for the world, of course. We had to suffer the outbreak of the Second World War to learn that desire for peace alone is not enough. It can't be said enough. A powerful institutional structure with the ability to exercise force must be in place to back up peace. This eventually came to include NATO, which was founded by Canada and 11 other nations on April 4th, 1949, upon Article 51 of the United Nations, giving everyone the right to self-defense and collective self-defense. The novel element that was introduced, however, and the one which was understood only because of our failures in the 1930s, was collective defense, and that collective defense through credible deterrence, peace through strength. We learned that the best hope for peace was unshakable unity, stopping that one-by-one cascade that we let happen before the Second World War, and making sure that that unity was bound up with a dedication to protect one another on a personal basis. All for one and all one for all and all for one is the cry you'll hear the Secretary General stating constantly, all of our leaders. It becomes kind of something that you just glaze over. But it is something that makes even a country as humble and middle-powered as Canada great. It makes us strong. It makes us part of something that is unstoppable. And that is something that Canadians must understand. We learned that the best hope for peace was unshakable unity and that dedication to protect one another, and that the treaty declared by those members would protect one another if attacked, and most importantly, that they would deter attacks by training together and displaying the will and capacity to maintain their defense. You may see in the newspapers just this week, Steadfast Defender, one of the largest NATO exercises ever held. These are held constantly, again and again, to make sure that we know how to work with one another. I'm not sure if you've ever had to organize anything that's large, including dozens of people, but it's miraculous that anything gets done at all, let alone with tens of thousands of people for a military exercise. And so constantly doing that, again and again, make sure that we can prove that we can look after ourselves. The moment we can't do that, NATO ceases to work in that deterrent quality. The threat of retaliation is the best way to ensure that those hungry to coerce or to take advantage of weakness are not able to do so. Unity is the only way to maintain that concept, and it is why the Alliance governs itself through constant meetings and the building of consensus. Consensus is a remarkable thing, and trying to run an organization through consensus sounds maddening. Every time you think about it, you need to make sure that every agenda is agreed upon. Every word that you say that comes out of a meeting has to be agreed upon. It really is a monumental achievement, and the only way that that happens is through the relationships that we've built over these decades, and that is constantly built every meeting. NATO ministers of defense meet every couple of months. NATO ministers of foreign affairs meet every couple of months. NATO chiefs of defense staff meet every couple of months. Then, of course, we have the heads of state and government that meet as well and form real bonds, so that anytime there's a misunderstanding, anytime that there seems to be a a chink in the armor, we can suddenly have a quick call with a personal relationship that can solve those problems. And that is something that a bare reading of the treaty would not show to anybody who cared to look. Every member must be in agreement with policies in action, and that's amazing every day that it happens. This unity is the main target of our competitors, of course, Russia and China. They constantly seek to drive wedges between NATO nations. The disinformation campaigns of the past decade and more, I think everybody in this room will realize that it almost doesn't matter what the issue is. It doesn't matter what we are arguing about. As long as we're arguing, the very disinformation campaigns are doing their work. And that's the whole point, is to drive wedges between NATO nations. Since 1949, of course, NATO has grown from 12 to 31 and very soon to be 32 members. The organization's changed as well. It's dealt with a lot of different existential questions. But again, it's the flexibility of the treaty itself that has allowed that to happen. Many people have kind of said after the fall of the Berlin Wall that NATO had lost its way. That would be true if the NATO treaty had identified the USSR as the target, essentially, or the other which NATO was working against. The people who came up with the NATO treaty never identified who the treaty was against, because it wasn't a treaty against things. It was a treaty for ourselves, for our alliance, for our friends. That's really what it's all about. And that flexibility, that idea, that aspect of interior support is what allowed the NATO alliance to survive the fall of the Berlin Wall, to morph into dealing with many different issues over the past several decades, and then, of course, to come right back where it started and dealing with a violent and vicious Russia. Since that time now, NATO has been shown to be one of the most important multilateral organizations on the planet. If any of you have had the chance to read Kim Nozzle's Canada Alone, you'll see that he and so many others have mentioned the degradation of international institutions. You'll see it in article after article, and you'll probably hear about it on the news. But NATO is one of the institutions that has held strong, that has perhaps become more well-based, has been understood by its members better in the past 2 years. And that adversity, like an anvil, has helped to beat the strength into the organization that may have fled it during the withdrawal from Afghanistan. So it's a terrible time. We've got so many different issues that seem to be crashing upon us like wave after wave. Social media bearing down upon us with the horrors of the world. And it is a terrible time. But NATO's goal is to stop the current situation from becoming even more terrible. And we don't need to go to science fiction or our imagination to try to figure out what our world could be like. We have history. A history that is littered with war. And a history where large proportions of our population were mowed down, and up to 38% of our GDP was spent on defense. This is why we must recognize the value of the institutions we have, such as NATO, but mainly NATO for today. It's the most important thing. When all seems to be lost, we have something that is really holding together, holding fast. And that is the kind of rock that we need to build on for Canadian hope and for Canada's grand strategy. NATO will help preserve the world we want, the world we've always wanted. Within our own public narratives, we've had an admirable concern for our own issues, for our own failures, for all of the things that we wish Canada would be doing better, that Canada seems to be broken with or wrong in our own society. But we also forget a sense of proportion and context. Democracy, after all, is the worst form of government, except for all the others. I'm sure most of you have heard that before. But it's the same with our country. Sure, yeah, it's the worst, except for all the others. And the same, I would say, with the rules-based international order. You have to see these things in proportion, not in context with some utopian hope or some idea that we could tear down and build something better. The goal here, I think, most importantly, the goal to replace a world where justice is decided by power with one where it is decided by the rule of law, I think would be the main goal of the rules-based international order and most of the institutions that are part of it. Maybe not explicitly, but just generally. That has been the goal since the Atlantic Charter was signed off of the coast of Newfoundland in 1941 by Churchill and Roosevelt. It was the idea of a better world, one that had been yearned for generations. This whole project, of course, was becoming a bit difficult to discern in the past few decades. But Russia's vicious invasion of Ukraine has renewed the unity and clarity of NATO towards the value of the rules-based international order. Putin didn't even try to disguise his aggression and ethno-national ambition. He reminded us that the peace and security we hold dear is not eternal. It's not self-perpetuating. He woke us from the slumber of the end of history, woke us from our own self-doubt and the understanding that the value of the world that was built for our forefathers and the end of the Second World War, that it was something worth fighting for, worth building upon again. I'd say we were certainly doubting it. I was, after the withdrawal of Afghanistan. Probably the lowest I've been, seeing all of that work poured into a heartfelt attempt to make some recompense and some peace out of chaos. However, despite that, with the invasion of Ukraine, NATO has become stronger, and we have to double down to support it. That is the key to the future of NATO, as it celebrates 75 years, and specifically Canada's role within it. As a middle power, Canada's grand strategy is the rules-based international order. I've heard so many arguments about can a middle power like Canada have a grand strategy? How can that be? Well, it's because the international rules-based order in turn only works if the large collection of middle powers like Canada materially support it. In the spring of 2017, Canada's Department of National Defence authored Strong, Secure and Engaged, our latest defence policy, which is being rewritten now. And the policy set a vision of Canada that was engaged in the world. That was the third part of Strong, Secure and Engaged. The publication was preceded by a memorable speech by the then Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chrystia Freeland. She announced that Canada's number one foreign policy goal was the support of the international rules-based order, of which NATO is a major element. The speech of Minister Freeland was the first time I had heard the term rules-based international order. I'm not sure about most of you, but most people were familiar before that with post-World War II order or liberal international order to describe a world where democracy, globalism, and free trade were the standards set by essentially the hegemonic power of the United States. I wasn't thrilled by the name. It's not exactly that inspiring, international rules-based order. But it became clear to me after I started looking at it that it made a lot of sense. It served several purposes. One, it disassociated that order from specific historical circumstances, which would make it forward-looking, always something we want. Number two, it avoided the term liberal, which could avoid confusion with modern liberal politics, of course, rather than the classical liberal ideas it espoused. And number three, it honed in on one of the central aspects of the order, that it was based on rules as opposed to pure power. The other advantage of this term is that it concentrates on methods rather than goals. The order is characterized by rules and institutions rather than the explicit outputs of democracy, free markets, etc. That means it's malleable, it's course-correcting, it can change. By giving primacy to the word international, we eschew overt connection to the United States or the allies of World War II more generally, And although the order is still unequivocally grounded by the real-world military and economic power of American hegemony, the eventual vision is a world where a phalanx of countries take on the mantle of supporting the order together, an order based on rules rather than power. And of course, the whole idea is that when you've got those multitudes working together, that becomes its own power. It becomes its own gravity. This begins to sound less utopian when collective action is involved by a preponderance of middle powers. But more on that a little later. It's worth me spending a few minutes to expand on the expression of these rules, namely through multilateral international institutions such as NATO. Most people will have heard of the concept of zero-sum transactions, in which every deal there is always a winner and always a loser. Mr. Trump, of course, was very fond of those. But what the Second World War and its aftermath helped express was the possibility of the non-zero-sum, win-win situation, in which, specifically, multiple actors participating in a deal could put in a little bit of effort and receive far greater reward as a result of collective action or collaboration. That is the whole basis of NATO and so many of the other institutions that we must support. The whole point, the idea, works in similar ways, be it security, like NATO, the Five Eyes, so many other security organizations, justice, economics, provides stability and predictability in order to maintain peace, develop, build, and invest. Another essential expression of these rules is that they are formed and regulated by institutions or bodies that are, for the most part, course-correcting and built to be resilient. They were created to be problem-solving tools. And I love it when you can actually see that in action. The communique as a tool for problem-solving, for deciding what are the agenda items, what should take precedence, almost always enables NATO to go in many directions at once, but then to be able to dwell on one particular issue if something comes up. And this specifically makes it so much more of a valuable element than strict, straight-jacketed authoritarianism. And this is one thing that we don't talk about enough. Authoritarian regimes are very rarely talked about in that kind of negative sense of not having answers. And I think we need to do that much more, because if you only have one answer, it is not an appropriate way to respond to the world. What NATO has in a plethora is many different answers. Resilience, the ability to deal with many different issues at the same time, and lots of people working on the worst case scenario. And that's because people are questioning all the time. And questioning is what has made our society great. That combined with unity. And that balance doesn't always work out terribly well for us, especially when disinformation is thrown into the mix. But that is the special superpower that we do have, I think. That ability to be resilient through many different issues being dealt with at the same time, especially those that we don't want to hear. Whereas when we're talking about autocratic situations, the dear leader will not hear anything against the victory of their particular chosen tactic or strategy. I think that you should look at the rules-based order as not a mechanical system, but more as an ecosystem. And that you'll find tomorrow and through many other studies, when you start uncovering the layers of NATO, you see that it's dealt with many different issues over the past 3 decades. And that is almost that evolutionary aspect. When other organizations are not necessarily doing as much as they should be doing, NATO starts developing a muscle. Be that peacekeeping after the terrible genocide in Kosovo, and suddenly putting together a peacekeeping force, which was not traditionally the idea of NATO. But there they were, and creating one of perhaps the best news stories of NATO's long history. And for most people, of course, the long history of NATO is one of the challenges. There is, of course, ideal situations where NATO worked, and those that were less than ideal, where NATO has fallen flat on its face, where it has had challenges, where it has been part of some, real tragedies in the world. And I don't think we can shrug that off. But the idea is that it's constantly learning and that it is course correcting, and that you want an organization that is willing to get involved in things that are challenging and that need to be made better. For most people, it's all very amorphous and vague in the way that it impacts their lives. Coming back here to Canada, how does NATO impact your life? How on a day-to-day basis does NATO give you any benefit whatsoever? It underpins the world that we've grown to expect. That's the challenge. It's something you don't see. It's an invisible thread that works under every moment that you're enjoying a festival or a concert, you're having coffee with a friend. Every moment like that has security woven into it without you understanding it or acknowledging it necessarily. And that might also include the ability to travel freely in the world, to have our goods and services traded. It's one of those things that you don't really see, but it underpins the world that we've grown to expect. That's one of my greatest concerns, of course, and that's one of the things that I think everybody in this room has to do, is to help try to remind your communities, your friends, the people that you deal with, that Canada can't be an island. It never has been. We do have 3 oceans on the sides of us, and of course the United States below us, but we cannot depend on anyone else to take on our responsibility. It is the one lesson we learned from the Second World War, to keep that idea that upon many shoulders we can do far more than sheer isolationism. It's just not the way forward, and we have so many deaths, so much destruction to prove it. For the past 75 years, people have been born great, essentially, without realizing it, been born into the greatness of the rules-based international order. We don't have anything to compare it with, except for those who have come to Canada as willing immigrants to our shores, who can give us some evidence of what life is like elsewhere. That's the only taste we have of another world. But try it 80 years ago, 100 years ago, 150 years ago. It's really important that we understand that this really is a miraculous system that we have, and that our organizations are just inexplicable almost. It's unbelievable that we were able to build them. The greatness was achieved by hard suffering and death, and the subsequent work to create this order must now be on all of our shoulders to continually work on it. Today, a world where we can securely travel from one end of the globe to another and trade with anyone sounds boring and natural, but it is one of the greatest achievements of human flourishing in the history of the world. Like anything else, if you don't appreciate it, you're going to lose it. You're likely to just float on. We cannot do this. That's why we all have to be dedicated to making sure Canadians appreciate what has been called the arsenal of freedom in the past. NATO, one of the most successful institutions and a main guarantor of the rules-based international order. In the first 2 decades of the 21st century, most of the democratic world has taken the role of the United States for granted. The mere existence of a superpower that is benevolent to a system that subverts some of its power or flexibility in the interest of global stability is really quite amazing. It's remarkable. There are 2 large and connected problems that we have stemming from this state of affairs. How do we transfer this order from being dependent on the hegemonic power of the United States so that it can survive the possible decline or inward turn of the United States? And connected to this problem, and one for us to consider here especially, is how do we specifically convince our fellow citizens that it is Canada's most important international goal to support NATO and the rules-based international order? How do we instill that idea in our everyday life when we don't see it, except in random social media posts or in a newspaper? How do you make sure that they do recognize that it's part of our life? We need to convince our fellow citizens because politicians require constituent support for the necessary funding. My job isn't necessarily to lobby for defense spending, but it is a real important aspect of NATO that all NATO countries are expected now as a floor to pay at least 2% of their GDP to defense. Now, you'll hear many aspects of how we are doing that, and perhaps the percentage point isn't properly calculated at the moment. But however the calculus is decided, we must all pay our due. We must hold the weight. So either persuade or obey, in my mind. It's really important that we do this. Despite positioning the support for the rules-based order at the top of our foreign policy, our domestic realities, of course, have many other things that push into the scene for politicians, continually grab our attention, of course. It's not unreasonable. It's natural, a natural extension of our expectations of security. We have to fight against that expectation, though. That's my point. How much can politicians really be expected to move public opinion when doing so means advocating for less funding for education, health, social services? It's an uphill battle, to say the least, but it's necessary. It's so challenging because if the current Ukrainian crisis teaches us one thing, it's that what we thought was normal is not normal. Peace and security are not normal. They have to be the exception, or they happen to be the exception for most of human history. Simply put, we need to help our citizens understand that without foundational security maintained by a community of middle powers, we will not be able to enjoy the very education, health, and social services we've come to expect, and that we wish to divert funding towards. We are currently in a cost of living crisis. Nobody can afford a place to live in the country. How can we push against that? That is what almost every politician is saying at the moment. We look to have an election in 2025. I don't see anybody pushing out defense spending to the top of the bill, nor do I expect to. But it should be there. It should be on the table, discussed as part, enmeshed with those aspects, with those other things that we enjoy as part of being part of the rules-based international order and the world that we want to be a part of. That's the true challenge to the future of NATO, I think. Right now, every day, there could be another issue that comes between two NATO nations and consensus is whittled away for one or another issue. That could happen any day, and day after day, that could slowly turn things so that people are no longer trusting one another. We will have seen that during Mr. Trump's first, hopefully only term as president. He has constantly said that America is better when it is looking inward and looking after themselves. It's not an unreasonable thing for a politician to say, after all. That is who their constituencies are. But the thing that we learned already is that it's far better when all of us are able to look towards the rest of the group. It takes far less for us to do that and be profitable, to be secure, and to make sure that we live in the world that we want. I've already mentioned China. It's been very deliberately touting its form of government as a more stable and profitable form than the protest-riddled West. When you look at social media, sometimes many people do bring this up, even in our own societies. It seems almost crazy, the amount of division we have. You'll often hear that autocratic governments have the edge on democratic governments when it comes to resolve, the ability to stick to a plan, or the longevity of those plans. Not surprising, every time we have an election of a new government, suddenly new priorities come on the list. We've got various other priorities that have to be demoted or promoted, and it does seem like we're doing stops and starts sometimes. We get plans that are shut down. We have various goals which are just forgotten. How could a confused cacophony of democracies constantly riven with division compete with Chinese methodological 100-year plans of the sort? How could democracies constantly working against each other, parties against parties, fissures creating in every aspect, every walk of life. How could we create the kind of vision required for long-term success? We're doubting ourselves constantly, and not in a way that's helpful or healthy, I think. Every year, the answer becomes clearer, and I want to make sure that those in this room and those who hear this message bring it to others in Canada and in the rest of the NATO alliance. We are not alone. We are strong when we're unified. We do have a grand strategy, a long-term plan. NATO and the rules-based international order is our 100-year plan. It's our grand strategy. People don't usually put it that way, but it's something that should give you hope, and it should make you appreciate all the work that's already gone into it. It's not a plan that binds itself to specific population goals or GDP numbers specifically. It's a plan that binds us to the multilateral, non-zero sum problem solving of the rules-based international order. It's like binding oneself to the scientific method instead of a specific output of science, if that makes sense. NATO is Canada's grand strategy of how to stay strong, secure, and engaged. We've said it. It's just that it hasn't permeated, I think. It's something that Canadians must know and must understand. It's something that we've worked so hard on, and it's something that everybody should know about. But NATO will only succeed if middle powers like Canada step up. And it's something where everybody in this country that is involved with academic interest, with civic interest, should be paying attention to, because we've got good news stories, we're just not telling them. A big part of the challenge of the allies in fully supporting NATO and the rules-based international order is the 4-year electoral cycle, as I've already mentioned. It can be in the interests of elected officials to work against or even undermine the value of the work that the UN or NATO or any other international institution does in the course of getting elected. Again, it's a tempting argument to make that money that we spend on our international endeavors, trying to make sure the rules-based international order can, follow through on the dream of generations that justice will finally win out over power. It's very easy to try to push that away for local politicians and to just say, well, we've got to look after our own self here. We've got a lot of problems. We have to look after ourselves. I'm going to work on me for now. That's just obviously so false when you look at the lessons of history. And whether we say we're going to spend it on education or health where we desperately need it, or we're going to maintain the world that allows us to have those things, it just seems like something that we need to have a conversation about on a national level more and more, and I think we're not. That is the goal that I want to make sure that most people here in this room are on board with. When I hear challenges to why NATO or the rules-based order fail, they're almost always individual instances of failure, in the same way that you could say science has failed in many different ways. And I want to remind you, it's the course correction that enables NATO and so many other institutions to be able to really shine forth as the kind of institutions we want to be. I suspect most of you have not read the NATO treaty. It was one of the first things I did, because I had to when I came to be an intern at the NATO Association of Canada. And it's one of those timeless documents. It's elegant, it's simplistic, it's 14 articles, and the only really important ones are the first 5. And so much of it is just buried in the ideals of the United Nations, hand in glove, to work with the ideals of that organization. And constantly it brings back just enough flexibility, the idea of pooled sovereignty, so that those individual members can have their individual foreign policies and defense policies, and yet still be within this grand strategy. And that's what the genius is. And of course, it's something similar for the International Criminal Court or the ICJ. Same thing with the Bretton Woods organizations for finance. And of course, governance more largely at the UN. There are always going to be structural issues in most of the institutions that we work with. But the goal is to keep working, to keep pushing. One of the things I constantly see is an urge to tear down and build things anew. And, you know, we can try new things for sure, but I keep trying to push to so many people that we have to go with what we've built because it has taken so much effort to get us where we are. People very often think that things are simpler, that they wouldn't be as complex if we just trashed what we have. And NATO specifically, of course, is something that is a pearl beyond price. NATO has created so much peace and security in the world. When I look at the history of the world and the way that NATO could have been used in past centuries, it's just amazing. And for this reason, we need to keep our eyes on maintaining broad public support for NATO as a foundation of the future of the institution. It's only going to work if we have broad public support. The challenge is, of course, that the Canadian government doesn't necessarily see it as its responsibility to promote its membership within NATO. And NATO itself obviously is concerned about putting too much information into the Canadian information space for fear of being called propagandistic. So we do have a slight challenge there. And I think we do have to get away from the idea of propaganda as necessarily a terrible thing. What else do you expect a country to do? What else do you expect an institution to do but to put its agenda forward to you? To say, this is what we believe in, this is why we're doing something, we're being as transparent as possible. Yes, we are human, we do make errors, but this is how we're trying to move forward. And that is the greatest thing I've come to acknowledge and to see at NATO. It's just people. It's just a group of people working together through relationships, through a tremendous amount of agreement, a bedrock of agreement that's already been made. And to throw that away just makes no sense to me. Just as failing to fund it properly or to agree on how we're going to do that seems to be counterproductive to me. When it is one of the most important things that we can reach towards in this day, and when we have so much that seems to be befuddling our thought space, this is the one clarity that we can reach towards. The rules-based international order, and especially NATO itself, is our grand strategy. We have to acknowledge that, and we have to make sure that Canadians around the country do see that. NATO is our grand strategy for continued peace, prosperity, and security. And we must all work to ensure that it survives long past another 75 years. Thanks very much.
Come and have a seat. So my name is Andrea Charron. I am the second incarnation of Paul Buteux, Jim Fergusson being the first. And I have the distinct pleasure of being able to ask Mr. Baines a few questions, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. But I think the first thing that Paul Buteux would say is he'd be astounded by the audience, and he would especially want to recognize how many students are here today. And we also have an international student base here because we have 2 cadets from West Point, and we have at least 8 from the University of North Dakota and their professors. This is part of the partnerships that we've developed over time. And we even have returning students. I mean, we thought we kicked you out, but you keep coming back. So we're thrilled that all of you are here. Now, one of the things you may not know about Mr. Baines is he's quite an opera fan. So I thought my first question should be, if you were going to devise an opera for NATO, what title would you give it?
Well, probably something it would have to be an opera buffa, which means that it's all dealing with fun and culture and lightness, because that is what we're working towards, the expression of what NATO has at its goal. I think that it would have to have probably 31 heroes, something akin to the Avengers, but terribly complex. And there would have to be a lot of sniping back and forth. Most of you will know that from the Avengers franchise. The reason that the franchise works is because these are people all working towards some goal, but they're always tripping over each other, having fights with one another, making fun of one another, but they get the job done, and it's a job that needs to be done. So it would be something akin to, a project that 31 flawed but honest and humorous individuals are working towards for the better good of mankind. So sounds like a challenging production, but...
So you get to go to Brussels quite often and speak to your international colleagues. We know that the Supreme Allied Commander for Europe, or the chief of NATO on the military side, is sort of preordained because it happens to be whomever the US picks as the EUCOM commander. So we don't really get a say in that. But we do in the Secretary General. And Jens Stoltenberg, and I think the civilian side of NATO is sometimes undervalued, but time and time again, it is the Secretary General who is the voice of NATO and has to do much of the collective cajoling of all the allies to bring them together. What are the sort of characteristics you need to be the Secretary General, and are there any insights in who might be next?
Well, I mean, it's a fascinating thing. If any of you have had a chance to listen to a press conference by Jens Stoltenberg, he is a canny operator. He was, of course, the head of Norway. He was previously, before that, his country's representative to the UN for environmental security. He is one of the most egoless people I've ever encountered, or certainly a politician, by God. He is a miraculous individual. He is able to build consensus in a way that I don't know if any of his predecessors were able to do. And he's now the longest-serving Secretary General, and he's dealt not only with a very changing space in Europe, but Donald Trump himself. With COVID, now with the Ukraine crisis. He is just an individual that can't be extolled enough as far as I'm concerned. And to find a replacement for him right now is one of the main challenges of NATO, especially if Mr. Trump gets reelected. Trying to have someone who deals with Mr. Trump appropriately, that is everything. And the way that Jens Stoltenberg was able to do that is he has no ego, or at least he seems to have no ego when he's in discussions. His interest is in curation, and very few politicians have that. So if Mr. Rutte, he's obviously come against some problems recently in some emails that were exposed in the past few weeks. He had a general consensus behind him, but it takes a lot of effort to make sure that everybody's appreciative of the Secretary General post. And as far as Canada, we've had a few names kicked around from time to time. I think it would be very challenging if we're not at the 2% threshold of our GDP spent on defense. It would be very, very difficult to convince anybody to go along with that. And specifically, I guess when we're talking about the prospects of a Secretary General as well, you'd then have both the military and the political leaders of NATO be both from North America, which could cause problems.
Mm-hmm. So you obviously are very pro-NATO, as you should be. I mean, it comes with a job. But I am sure a few of us, and I'm not looking at you, Jim, but eyebrows will start to go up. One of the perennial problems or concerns has been that collective defense is for London or for Paris or for Washington, but it's not for Riga or Warsaw or Helsinki. Disabuse me of that.
Well, I mean, I don't know. It's a challenge when you take a look at the sudden build-up in the alliance of divisions as far as who are we defending and what kind of powers do we have to have in place to give a proper deterrence. I would say that the enhanced forward presence, as it's been built up over the past 3 years now, I guess especially, has been able to give the symbolic presence of NATO. What is required now on the eastern flank is the actual ability to put boots on the ground. As I mentioned, and of course many people will be aware of, the real goal of NATO is not only to be, tell people that you'll defend, but to be able to actually defend the ground. Every inch of NATO territory has been constantly refrained again and again since the invasion of Ukraine. And so the dispositions of NATO troops, the rapid reaction forces that are being built up are meant to assuage those fears that when push comes to shove, people will not come to the defense of our eastern allies specifically. I can tell you that those in Latvia, I had a chance to visit in June, they are still absolutely convinced that Russia, no matter if it's a couple of years away now, will be marching across their border or will attempt to do something if it's not explicitly an invasion. They are quite convinced of it, and they are convinced that they will fight tooth and nail. And the only thing that does give them some semblance of hope that NATO will stand up with them is the enhanced forward presence, even though it's been only growing from about 1,500 to now several thousand. It is one of those things that is collaborative with 11 nations together there. That symbolic nature sometimes can do a tremendous amount to be able to give people the hope and to give people the wherewithal to start believing in the alliance and that it will be able to actually come to their aid. The current crisis is in ammunition more than anything else, I'd say. With everybody sending everything they have to Ukraine, that becomes a real issue. In Latvia specifically, they were saying 72 hours, no more of ammunition is what they have. And is that the right choice to send everything to Ukraine? I would say yes. I think a lot of strategic thinkers would agree with that. But I don't know. From me, the political level, it's a very impressive unity that NATO's been able to gather over the past 3 years, and specifically 2 since the invasion of Ukraine.
Thanks. Well, we have the opportunity for members of the audience. So I have 2 students who are going to come with microphones, but I want to introduce the 5 students who were responsible for putting this together. We have Ashley and Jay. We have Madeline with one of the microphones. We have Eleni with one of the microphones. And then we have David. And they're the reason we have this conference going on. So if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand and they will bring you a microphone. But in the meantime, so I think we need a microphone over there. So we'll just pass that up. So just introduce yourself and then your question. Please go ahead.
Hi there. My name is Susi. I'm an alumni at the University of Manitoba. I've done my degree in poli-sci, specifically with my mentor, Dr. Charron and Dr. Fergusson. So I appreciate you coming here, and thank you for the invite, of course. My question is multifaceted, so I really apologize for that. I would like to touch on the 2% for just a second. So you spoke about the challenges of our governments taking things seriously when it comes to defense policy. The government's not putting much stock in the CAF, and that's not an understatement. I have been a witness to them at the Enhanced Forward Presence in Latvia, and I've personally been in Norfolk, Virginia at the NATO Allied Command Transformation, or ACT. I've seen firsthand the double, triple, and even quadruple hats some of our service members actually wear in the important roles that they have. This isn't a choice. They have to wear them. What role do you have in pushing that message to not only the Prime Minister's office, but also to MPs on all sides? And do you have a strategy? More importantly, should it be your job in your opinion? If not, whose is it? Is it Canadians? Is it our allies? Could it even be the US? Maybe Trump. I'd like to leave it to you.
So wait, I'll give you some intel on Susi. He went to the NATO Field School,
Nice.
which is an incredible opportunity. So he has met with all the top generals. He has been over to Europe. He has been in Latvia. So you're in
Perfect.
trouble.
No. I mean, it's something that we've grappled with as an organization. The NATO Association, when it was founded in 1966, the whole point of it was to educate Canadians about the value of security. Lobbying the government specifically, politicians, is something that we have done through our educational endeavors. I I wouldn't say sotto voce, but it's certainly as a secondary element. It is definitely not our mandate. There should be an organization that does that. Our organization right now is looking to see how we might change that. But the challenge becomes in taking a look at policies specifically and defense spending. We are a nonpartisan organization. We have critiqued specific policies from time to time, but the spending aspect particularly, our organization has always just supported Canada, supporting NATO as much as possible, but mainly sticking to education of what NATO is in Canada. That's why it's a little, challenging from our side, but we hope that the government will spend, and every time we talk to various members of the government, there is a constant discussion on that. But they have made it very clear, until the Canadian public start telling their MPs that they want more defense spending, i.e. it is a door-knocking issue, they're not going to do anything significant. And that makes me, a little despondent. I've always thought leaders should lead, but I mean, it's not particularly surprising. So in a way, we do need citizens to knock on the doors of their MPs. But at this point, it is not the NATO Association of Canada's direct job to try to galvanize the population to do that.
Oh, got a question up here.
Hello, my name is Maria Shemcheshin. I am from Kyiv National Linguistic University, Ukraine, and here I am a visiting scholar. I have just arrived, so this is actually my maybe first lecture that I visited here.
Welcome.
And thank you. Thank you for this thought-provoking and very persuasive lecture. And of course, my question will be about membership, Ukraine's membership in NATO. And I would like you to comment on this, or what are your thoughts about our future membership in NATO? Because from 1991, after the Declaration of Independence, our way was toward European Union and NATO. But unfortunately, in 2008, we were blocked by Germany and by Angela Merkel at that time. And recently, during the summit that you mentioned in Vilnius, our membership was blocked by the US and Germany. Again, so what is your understanding that on the one side, these major superpowers like the US and Germany, they are providing very serious military and humanitarian support. On the other hand, they are actually blocking our membership in NATO. And so just now, Ukraine is bleeding. Thousands of people are dying, but still we cannot get this very, very necessary membership. Thank you.
Indeed, and thank you for the question, and I'm so glad you're here. At the Vilnius summit, the NATO-Ukraine Council was formed as a mechanism whereby all NATO members could gather together to work on a consensus basis on how Ukraine can join NATO. Traditionally, there would be something called the Membership Action Plan, which would be a combination of many different factors, financial, military, governmental, that would basically dictate whether a country was checking all the boxes, etc. And only after that was completed would that country be put up for membership and for a vote. In this case, NATO has tried to sidestep that and make it faster by the NATO-Ukraine Council working on each individual aspect as a consensus group together. The reason that membership was blocked is just by sheer logistics. NATO's main reason for being is to protect its citizens, its 1 billion citizens. And the moment that Ukraine, if it was in open conflict, became a NATO member, then all of NATO would soon be at war. immediately by effect. The Secretary General has made it very clear that as soon as the conflict ends, one way or another, that is when Ukraine would be invited, but not until then. It is a tragedy, and the goal, of course, is to continue the emphasis and the impetus towards continued spending and equipment going towards Ukraine. But until that point, it's just not a feasible option to have Ukraine join NATO while it is at conflict, because we don't want to widen the conflict any more than it already is.
Susie, you've got it again. Oh, and then we've got one over there. Yeah.
Sorry, hello again. So Canada has recently actually opened its own Center of Excellence in Montreal. Absolutely fantastic, in my opinion, on climate security. I think it's an aspect that NATO has actually overlooked until up to recently, so it's really good and great that we're actually taking it seriously and actually putting it into consideration when it comes to our defense policy. But for the NATO Association specifically, is this really beneficial for Canada when our priorities and other aspects are lacking, and I've seen it firsthand? Or do you actually see this as a good step forward, showing Canada's commitment to the association? Because there's two arguments for and against.
Yeah, well, actually, I'd present something slightly different as well. Climate security is something that I think a majority of Canadians are concerned about. Climate change, certainly. And when it comes to NATO, it is sometimes difficult to bring NATO into a conversation on its own. If you have an event about NATO, on its own, maybe not so many people will come unless those who already know about NATO. They will come, but those who have no idea will not. If you have an event on climate security, or if you start talking about climate security from a NATO point of view, I think it's much more likely that people are going to be interested and say, oh, wow, what is this NATO organization? I thought it was, just about bombs, and, without realizing the collaborative endeavor that it truly is and the ability that it has to problem solve in so many areas of collective action. And the fact that climate security is what Canada chose and not an Arctic Center, I'm sure that was in discussion before. It was the UN Women, Peace and Security Center at the Canadian Forces College with Romeo Dallaire. The NATO connection for a Center of Excellence was also talked about there as well. So I think the fact that we just have a NATO entity or NATO appended entity in Canada is just great to get more of the organization understood in Canada, because it is a complex and very amorphous organization that we just need more exposure to.
Hi, thank you. I'm in Professor Charron's class, and I'm also going to NATO Field School this summer, so this has been a great introduction to the institution and its intent. My question is, you mentioned NATO's focus being more malleable and self-correcting and focusing more on that evolutionary aspect of the institution in recent years. NATO is often critiqued as being an extension of US foreign policy, but that the institution is trying to brace for an evolution away from this idea. Given America's intricate ties with the founding ideology, the bureaucracy, and the practice of NATO, I'm wondering how the institution is attempting this and working towards this.
Well, I don't have, thank you, first of all, for the question. Excellent question. I don't have all the inside skinny on what's going on at NATO HQ at the moment on those issues, but the sheer fact that Mr. Trump is possibly going to be elected president has definitely brought that up in many different quarters. He has made comments again and again that he wants to remove the United States from NATO. It took him something like 6 months when he became president to acknowledge that Article 5 would be respected, which is the main article of the alliance, that an attack upon one is an attack upon all. So that kind of aspect, right now NATO is inextricable from the United States. Its ability to deliver on any serious military expeditionary capacity, it is indispensable, 100%. I don't think that it's really an option to work on the idea that NATO would be able to hum along just fine without the United States, but the idea that the United States does need to see everybody else pulling their weight is, I think, essential. And those evolutions could be decades in the making. If NATO can continue to maintain the pocket of defense and security that we've had for the past 75 years onwards, maintaining an ability to project security in places beyond the North Atlantic area, I think that there is some real opportunity to kind of evolve away from the primacy. But right now, there's no ability whatsoever, I think.
So I think we have time for maybe 2 more or 3 more questions. So we'll take 1, 2, 3. We'll take all those questions and see what the time is like. So please ask your questions, and then we'll get Mr. Baines to do an omnibus answer. Go ahead.
Perfect, thank you. Thank you for coming. Absolutely amazing speech. I enjoyed it immensely. First of all, too, as a bit of a side note, I'd like to appreciate that you raised the discussion surrounding Trump and the uncertainty that comes with a little bit of the alliance's overdependence, if you will, on the US. I'm fortunate enough, I'll be speaking at the Canadian Undergraduate Security Conference, and I chose that topic because I find it to be vital to the future, given the emergence of his popularity once again, right? But my question for you today was, given the democratic backsliding in a few NATO countries, and given the growing number of countries, do we or ought we be concerned with potentially becoming so big that we cannot manage or self-govern ourselves, or the values that are the raison d'etre of the alliance? Your thoughts?
Great. Thanks. Okay, and then we'll get the second question that was right there. Yeah, right there. There we go. So backsliding in size.
Thank you. John Sears, CIC Winnipeg. I think this piggybacks on our Ukrainian colleague's question. We had the chance to hear from the Latvian ambassador a couple years ago, and so my question, I guess, is a historical question. You know, why post-invasion of Ukraine rather than post-annexation of Crimea or post-2008 or post-late 90s? The Latvian ambassador was quite clear that, you know, they've been staring down this problem for a while. So it's, I guess, a question about, again, this evolutionary aspect you mentioned about how can we understand better, you know, the particular context in which this awareness, like, no one's surprised, and yet we sort of, oh my goodness, all of a sudden this is a thing. Hasn't it kind of been somewhat of a thing already? Thank you.
Okay. Backsliding size and why? And then Doug.
Okay. Douglas Fergusson, Carleton University. On multiple occasions you alluded to the question of China and NATO. Under what provision of the treaty or article are you going to be able to mobilize NATO for a war against China?
All done? Outstanding. So, democratic backsliding, and is the alliance getting too big? It's interesting. Certainly, expansion has been, it's always had an open door policy, NATO itself. There's been a varying degree of appetite, certainly, sometimes more, sometimes less. With the changes in governments, you've had some which are more autocratic than others. Right now, of course, a lot of Canadians are concerned about Hungary and Turkey specifically, but some others as well. It's always a challenging aspect. NATO has a values-based aspect to it. The whole preamble is about supporting democratic values, the ideas of independent judiciary, all of that great stuff that we think of as democratic ideals. But the alliance itself, although it has a high threshold for expectations on democratic institutions and a lack of graft and civilian command over the military, once you're a NATO member, there's no way to regulate that. There's no way to suddenly penalize a country for backsliding. So it is in some ways a great challenge of the alliance. But at the same time, it does allow for some usefulness as well. When it comes to Turkey and Hungary, although we disagree with a great deal of their policies, they are still in consensus with NATO on so many aspects of our security. And at the same time, remember, these are personalities as well. And the fact that you can have different personalities as interlocutors with other people, i.e. what I mean is that they have different relationships, these rulers, these heads of government of various NATO nations. And sometimes that allows them to have different conversations that wouldn't necessarily be able to be had with Jens Stoltenberg, for instance. So in some ways, it is a little bit more flexible. It's not ideal by anyone's stretch of the imagination as far as the founding ideals of the organization are concerned, but in some cases it is, to our advantage. And in some cases, it's better to have them inside the tent than outside, to use a part of a comment about that. And as far as, sorry.
So the next one was Latvia, and why now? Why not before?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating, it reminds me of our goals and our hopes. And in some ways it was, or could be described as appeasement. The fact that we didn't go in after Russia was taking over parts of Georgia. We didn't go in and stand for our ideals when Crimea was invaded. I think people just were not willing to stand at that time. They thought that they could stop a major war, and very often that is a very, very attractive goal for most politicians. If they have other issues going on, nobody wants to make a big deal of something when they're not, their skin is not directly in the game. It's dishonorable, it is disappointing, but it's not perhaps surprising at the time. But you're right, the Latvian ambassador, everybody on the eastern flank of NATO that you talk to, this is not surprising. They've been saying this again and again, and I think the problem is that so many, especially far, Western leaders, France, Germany, the UK, perhaps the United States and Canada, were all just very complacent. We thought nobody would do this again. It's the 21st century. People don't do that anymore. They're not going to be recidivists. They're not going to be trying to grab for empire again. Who would do that? No, we're way past that. I honestly believe there was just this disbelief. Head in the sand, I'm afraid. Again, I think it's most disappointing, but there you are.
And then finally, China.
Yes, so NATO does not have any mandate in the Indo-Pacific expressly. The NATO treaty is very clear on what NATO's geographic extensions are. However, at the same time, the Pacific coast of the United States and Canada is a NATO coast. They don't describe it as such very often. Once in a while we talk about it as such, but there is a certain degree of interest in maintaining security and stability in that area. And more, the interests of freedom of navigation and so many other issues like that have come up. The importance of stability in the Indo-Pacific. NATO continually talks about security, global security, being indivisible. So those are the kind of indications that NATO has made that we're concerned about the Indo-Pacific. The constant visits, certainly before last year, of the Deputy Secretary General to China on a number of occasions show the interests in making sure that there's good communication with China. Trying to avoid misunderstandings obviously is a big role. But things like opening an information office or communications office in Japan, in Tokyo, have caused issues. And as most of you will have encountered, Russia's constant refrain that it was NATO's fault that they invaded Ukraine because NATO was encroaching upon the Russian sphere of influence. Well, you can only imagine that China would use the exact same language and idea. It has worked very well for Russia trying to convince people that, of course, it was only right. We have spheres of influence. NATO rejects that completely, but it still has worked as a very good communication tool for Russia. And China, I'm sure, would use the exact same language the more that NATO encroaches on the Indo-Pacific. So I'm sure it will be very, very careful whatever further interaction it has in the Indo-Pacific.
Well, I wish we had time for more questions, but we don't. So I'd like to invite Brad Kerbeson, who will give the final thank you, and encourage all of you to come tomorrow to University College in the Great Hall. At 10 a.m., we'll have a panel on the NATO of the past. At 1 p.m., it's NATO of the present. And at 2:30, it's NATO of the future, and it's free and open to everybody. So Brad Fergusson from the CIC.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Charron. It's a real pleasure for me to be offered the opportunity on behalf of the CIC to extend thanks to our guest speaker tonight. Thank you very much, Robert. We very much enjoyed your presentation, and I have to say I had the pleasure of meeting Paul Buteux many years ago, and I believe that he would have really appreciated your approach and the insights that you showed towards NATO. And I know he would have really enjoyed the conversation with Dr. Charron and the questions. He would have really loved that part. So thank you very much for your presentation, and I appreciate you spending time with us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.